Rain hammered the cracked pavement, bleeding neon light into the puddles. Clara's boots soaked through, freezing her toes. But she couldn't stop. It was Maya's birthday. 6 years old, shivering under a frayed blanket in a damp apartment, waiting for a cake Clara couldn't afford. Desperation tastes like pennies and ash. She pushed open the door to a closing bakery, shivering, ready to beg. She didn't know the city's most ruthless shadow was sitting in the corner booth, listening. Drip, drip, drip. Water from the rotting awning of Rousseau's patisserie offered zero protection against the November downpour. Clara stood shivering beneath it, watching the filthy water pool around her scuffed boots. Her toes had gone numb 20 minutes ago. Now, a dull, aching throb climbed up her calves. She shoved her hands deeper into the pockets of her synthetic trench coat. Her cold fingers brushed against crumpled bills and a few metallic coins. $7.43. It was a pathetic sum. It was insulting, but it was everything she had to her name. She stared through the greasy glass of the bakery door. The warm yellow light inside looked like a different universe, one where people bought pastries wrapped in pink twine and didn't check their bank accounts before swiping a card. Maya was turning 6 today. Right now, she was sitting on a stained mattress in an apartment that smelled perpetually of boiled cabbage and bleach, waiting. Clara had promised her a cake. A promise made out of pure, foolish, maternal desperation. Clara pushed the heavy glass door. The bell above it gave a rusty, strangled chime. Warm air rushed over her, thick with the heavy scent of caramelized sugar, stale yeast, and lemon floor wax. It made her empty stomach cramp violently. Behind the glass display counter stood Albert, a man with doughy skin, thinning hair, and eyes entirely devoid of empathy. He was violently attacking a stainless steel tray with a grey rag. Clara's cheap boots squeaked against the wet linoleum. She winced. She hated that sound. It announced her poverty before she even opened her mouth. "We're closing," Albert grunted, not bothering to look up. Clara stopped at the counter. The glass was cool against her palms. She stared at the display. Most of the trays were empty, but on the top shelf sat a masterpiece. A 3-tiered dark chocolate cake decorated with spun sugar roses. It looked like an insult to her reality. She swallowed the dry, sharp lump in her throat. Her pride had died a slow, ugly death over the last 3 years. After her husband emptied their accounts and vanished, leaving her with massive debt and a toddler with chronic asthma, pride became a luxury she couldn't afford. "I know, I'm sorry." Her voice sounded thin, reedy. She cleared her throat to ground it. "I just wanted to ask you something." Albert scrubbed harder. Clara gripped the edge of the glass. "Is there any expired cake? For my daughter? It's her birthday. I only have $7, but I'll take whatever you were going to throw in the dumpster, even if it's stale. Please." The words tasted like bile. She squeezed her eyes shut, fighting the hot prickle of tears. Crying was useless. Crying didn't feed a kid. In the far corner of the shop, half swallowed by the heavy shadows, a man sat motionless. Clara hadn't seen him. He blended perfectly into the dark leather booth, a heavy charcoal overcoat draped over his broad shoulders. Gabriel Rossi didn't belong in a cheap bakery on the edge of the industrial district. He belonged in high-rise boardrooms or in velvet-lined underground clubs, or perhaps standing quietly over a fresh grave. Not here. He was nursing a lukewarm black coffee, killing 30 minutes while his crew handled a messy territorial dispute 2 blocks away. He heard her. Gabriel possessed a mind engineered to catalogue human weakness. It was how he maintained power. He listened to the slight tremble in the woman's voice. He observed the frayed cuffs of her coat dripping rainwater onto the pristine floor. He smelled the ozone clinging to her wet hair, cutting through the bakery's sugar-heavy air. Albert finally looked up, his lip curling into a sneer. "We don't sell garbage. Against health codes. Go to a shelter." Clara's knuckles turned stark white against the glass. "You throw it away anyway," she whispered, her voice tightening. "I've seen the black bags in the back alley. I'm not asking for charity. I have $7, just one slice, a cupcake, anything." I said no. "Get out before I call the cops for loitering." A muscle ticked violently in Clara's jaw. A sudden, terrifying wave of rage washed over her. She wanted to scream. She wanted to smash the display case with her bare fists and grab the chocolate cake. She imagined the glass shattering, the alarm blaring. She would go to jail, and Maya would go into the foster system. The rage evaporated, leaving only a hollow, sick exhaustion. Survival meant swallowing the anger. She nodded. A tight, jerky, robotic motion. "Okay, thank you." She turned to leave, her boots squeaking again. "Wait!" The voice didn't come from behind the counter. It came from the shadows. It was low, rough, like heavy gravel rolling over a sheet of velvet. Clara froze. The man in the booth stood up. He was tall, overwhelmingly so, blocking out the dim street light filtering through the side window. As he stepped forward, the neon open sign buzzed, briefly illuminating a face carved from hard lines. A sharp jaw, deep-set, exhausted eyes, and a faint, silver scar slicing through his left eyebrow. He moved with a terrifying liquid grace. Absolutely silent. Albert went pale. The doughy man seemed to shrink. He knew exactly who was in his shop. Gabriel walked past Clara. He smelled of rain, expensive cedarwood, and something sharp and metallic beneath it all. Copper. Blood. Clara's stomach dropped. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs felt like lead. He stopped at the counter. He didn't look at Albert. He pointed a scarred, bare finger at the large chocolate cake on the top shelf. "Box it," Gabriel said. Albert scrambled, dropping his rag. "Mr. Rossi, that's an order for tomorrow morning. It's $50. Gabriel tilted his head. Just a fraction of an inch. The silence in the room suddenly felt physical. It pressed against Clara's eardrums. "Box it," Gabriel repeated. The tone was softer this time. Deadlier. Albert's hands shook violently as he grabbed a large white cardboard box and began wrestling the cake into it. Clara stood rooted to the spot. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. I can't pay for that," she stammered, stepping backward towards the door. Gabriel turned his head to look at her. His eyes were the color of a bruised winter sky, cold yet strangely hollow. "I didn't ask you to pay." The street outside was a labyrinth of wet, gleaming asphalt and flickering yellow street lamps. Clara walked fast, practically jogging, clutching the large, heavy cake box against her chest. The cardboard was already getting damp from the drizzle, but she didn't care. Maya was going to have a cake. A real decadent, absurdly heavy cake. Yet dread coiled tight and heavy in Clara's gut. Nothing in this city was free. She had learned that the hard way, especially not from men who wore tailored coats and carried silence like a loaded weapon. Men who made cruel bakers tremble just by breathing the same air. Footsteps behind her, slow, rhythmic, perfectly spaced. Clara's breath hitched in her throat. She tightened her grip on the box and sped up, taking a sharp left into a narrow alleyway that cut through to the back of her apartment building. The moment she turned the corner, she knew it was a stupid mistake. The alley was pitch black, stinking of rotting garbage, damp brick, and sour beer. The footsteps followed. They didn't speed up. They just kept that same relentless, predatory pace. panic spiked, hot and bright. She dropped her free hand into her pocket, fingers wrapping around her house keys. She arranged them between her knuckles. It was a pathetic defense. You walk too fast for someone wearing cheap boots with worn soles. The voice echoed slightly off the wet brick walls. Clara spun around, her chest heaving. He was there, standing at the entrance of the alley, a tall, broad silhouette against the distant street lights. He wasn't hurrying. He was just watching her. "What do you want?" Clara's voice shook. She hated herself for it. "I told you I couldn't pay you. I didn't ask for your help back there." Gabriel took a slow step forward into the darkness of the alley. "If I wanted your money, I wouldn't have bought you a $50 cake. Put the keys away before you break your own fingers." Clara swallowed hard, keeping her fist clenched in her pocket. "Then what do you want? Men like you don't do favors. Men like me." He let out a dark, humorless breath that might have been a laugh. "What kind of man am I?" "The kind who hurts people." She didn't know why she said it. It was stupid, suicidal, but she was exhausted. Exhausted from being poor, from being scared, from begging men who held all the power. Gabriel stopped a few feet away, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him in the damp chill. Close enough to see the deep lines of exhaustion etched around his mouth. "You have a daughter," he stated. It wasn't a question. Clara stiffened, her protective instinct flaring. "Don't talk about her. 6 years old. Today?" He reached into his coat pocket. Clara flinched, bracing for a weapon. Instead, he pulled out a heavy silver lighter and a crushed cigarette. He flicked the lighter open. The sudden flame illuminated his sharp features. He wasn't looking at her. He was staring into the small fire. "My sister would have been 30 today. She died when she was 6. Clara blinked, the sheer unpredictability of the statement throwing her entirely off balance. The hostility stalled in her throat. "Pneumonia," Gabriel continued, lighting the cigarette and snapping the silver lid shut. The darkness rushed back in, save for the cherry-red ember of the tobacco. "Because my mother was too proud to beg, and we had no heat in our building." She froze in her sleep. Clara stared at him. The rain dripped from her hair, running down her neck under her collar. She hugged the cake box tighter. The sharp, terrifying image of this Mafia enforcer dissolved for a split second, replaced by the image of a starving kid in a freezing room. "I'm sorry," she said. The words slipped out automatically. "Don't be. It was a long time ago. The world is built on dead things." He took a slow drag, the ember flaring. He stepped back, giving her space. "Take the cake to your kid. Tell her happy birthday." He turned to leave, his long coat swishing against the wet pavement. Clara watched his broad back recede towards the street. Her mind raced. The logic of the slums dictated she run inside and lock the door, but the human being inside her, the one starved for any shred of decency in a vicious world, spoke up before she could stop herself. "Why follow me?" she called out to his retreating back. Gabriel paused. He glanced over his shoulder. The street lamp caught the silver scar on his brow to make sure nobody jumped you and stole it. He said simply, his voice flat. "This neighborhood is a cemetery for nice things. Go home, Clara." He knew her name. Before she could process the chill that sent down her spine, he vanished into the dark, leaving Clara alone in the alley with a pristine cake and a racing heart. 3 days passed. The cake was gone, devoured over 3 nights by a very sticky, very happy Maya. The dark chocolate stains on her cheap, pilled pajamas were a badge of honor she refused to let Clara wash away. But the sugar high eventually faded, and reality crashed back down with the force of an anvil. Rent was due. Clara scrubbed the laminate tables at the diner until her knuckles split and bled. The smell of old grease, burnt coffee, and cheap syrup clung to her pores, settling deep into her skin. She emptied her apron pocket at the end of a double shift, counting her crumpled bills on the counter. $32. She was $250 short. Her landlord, a perpetually sweaty man named Henderson, had already slipped a pink eviction warning under her door. Worse, Maya's cough was returning. A deep, wet, rattling sound that kept Clara awake at night, staring at the ceiling, mapping the yellow water stains like constellations of her own failures. It was Tuesday night, 11:45 p.m. Clara locked the heavy glass doors of the diner and began the long trudge home. The wind was sharp, biting violently at her exposed neck. She didn't walk through the alley this time. She stuck to the main roads, her eyes darting nervously at every shadow. She hadn't seen the man, Gabriel Rossi, she had learned after a terrified Google search at the public library, since the bakery. Head of the Rossi syndicate, controlled the eastern docks, illegal gambling rings, and half the city's underground logistics. A ghost. A monster. Clara reached her building. The hallway smelled strongly of boiled cabbage and cat urine. The overhead bulb on her floor was burnt out, leaving the corridor plunged in gloomy grey light. As she reached her door, her heart stopped. The lock was completely shattered. The cheap wood around the deadbolt hung in jagged splinters. Clara stopped breathing. Her keys slipped from her numb fingers, hitting the scuffed linoleum with a deafening clatter. Maya was inside. She was supposed to be asleep with Mrs. Higgins, the elderly half-deaf woman from down the hall who watched her for $10 a night. "Maya!" Clara screamed, pushing the broken door open, ignoring every survival instinct that told her to run away and call the police. The apartment was pitch black. "Maya!" "She's asleep." The voice came from the cramped living room. It was calm, deep, familiar. Clara scrambled for the wall switch, her hands shaking violently. The harsh yellow light flickered on. Sitting in her ratty thrift store armchair, looking absurdly out of place, was Gabriel Rossi. He was wearing a dark, tailored suit, though his tie was loosened. He looked incredibly tired. A heavy, silver-handled cane rested against his knee, something he hadn't carried in the alley. Clara's wide eyes darted immediately to the bedroom door. It was slightly ajar. She could hear the soft, rhythmic, congested wheeze of Maya breathing. She was safe. She whipped her head back to Gabriel. Her maternal terror morphed instantly into hot, blinding rage. She grabbed a heavy glass vase from the side table, dumping the dead, dried flowers onto the floor. "Get out!" she hissed, her whole body vibrating. "Get the hell out of my house!" Gabriel didn't flinch. He didn't even look at the improvised weapon in her trembling hand. He was looking at the peeling floral wallpaper, at the leaking radiator held together with duct tape, at the stack of red-stamped past-due bills sitting on the tiny kitchen counter. "Your landlord," Gabriel said, his voice terrifyingly conversational, "is a pig. He broke the door trying to physically throw you and your kid out onto the street tonight. Ranted about you being 3 days late." Clara felt the blood drain from her face, pooling in her feet. Henderson. He had threatened to change the locks, but she never thought he'd do it violently while her child was inside. "Where is he?" she asked, her voice cracking. Her grip on the vase faltered. "In the ICU," Gabriel replied, mildly, picking a piece of lint off his suit jacket. He slipped and fell down 3 flights of stairs, broke both his legs and his jaw. Very clumsy man. Clara lowered the vase slowly. The heavy implication hung in the damp air of the room. He had crippled a man for her. No, Clara wasn't stupid. Gabriel Rossi didn't do things for diner waitresses. He did things because he wanted leverage, because he wanted to own things. I can't pay you for a hit, she whispered bitterly, stepping further into the room but keeping her distance. I couldn't pay for a piece of cake. I can't pay for a hospital bill. Sit down, Clara. I prefer to stand, Gabriel sighed, leaning his head back against the armchair. He closed his eyes for a second. You have a degree in forensic accounting. You dropped out 3 months before graduation when you got pregnant. You've been working under-the-table jobs for 3 years because your ex-husband ruined your credit score, defaulted on a loan in your name, and vanished. Clara felt stripped naked. A cold sweat broke out on her neck. Have you been investigating me? I investigate everyone I intend to employ. Gabriel opened his eyes and looked at her. She stared at him, the vase hanging limply at her side. Employ? He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope. He tossed it onto the cheap coffee table. It landed with a heavy, substantial thud. I need a bookkeeper, Gabriel said, leaning forward, resting his hands on the head of his cane. Someone who understands complex numbers but doesn't exist on paper. Someone desperate enough to keep their mouth shut and smart enough to know I'll bury them in cement if they don't. Clara looked at the envelope. She knew exactly what was inside. Cash, enough to fix the door, pay rent for a year, take Maya to a real pediatrician instead of a free clinic. It was a trap. A velvet-lined steel cage. Once you worked for a man like Gabriel Rossi, you didn't leave. You retired in a body bag. Why me? She asked, her voice barely a breath. You could hire 100 corrupt accountants. Gabriel met her eyes. The dead, cold emptiness in his gaze fractured, just for a fraction of a second, revealing something dark, ravenous, and profoundly damaged beneath. Because a mother begging a stranger for expired cake for her kid has nothing left to lose, he said softly. And people with nothing to lose are the only ones I trust. He stood up slowly, leaning slightly on the cane. He towered over her in the cramped, suffocating room. The money is in advance, he said, walking past her toward the broken door. He smelled of rain and cold iron. Fix your lock. Buy the kid a warm coat and some medicine. A car will pick you up on Thursday at 8 a.m. I didn't say yes, Clara called after him, her heart thumping wildly against her ribs. Gabriel paused in the doorway. He looked back at her over his shoulder, the hallway shadows clinging to him. No, he agreed, his voice a low rumble. But you will. He stepped out, and Clara was left alone in the silence, staring at the envelope that held her salvation and her damnation. $100 bills feel different than 1s and 5s. They are crisper, heavier. They don't smell like sweat and cheap wallets. They smell like ink and possibility. Clara sat on the edge of the stained mattress, staring at the thick stack of cash resting on her knees. $2,000. It was a terrifying amount of money to hold in a room with a broken lock. Maya was sleeping, her small chest rising and falling with a faint, rattling wheeze. Survival makes hypocrites of us all. Clara took the money. By Wednesday afternoon, the door had a new, heavy steel deadbolt. The pantry was lined with name-brand pasta, fresh vegetables, and whole milk. Most importantly, sitting on the chipped bathroom counter was a pristine white pharmacy bag. Inside were 3 different inhalers and a bottle of heavy-duty antibiotics. They smelled of artificial cherry and sterile plastic. To Clara, they smelled like a future. Thursday morning arrived with the grey, suffocating dampness typical of the city. Clara stood on the curb at 7:55 a.m. She wore her only interview-appropriate outfit, a black pencil skirt that was slightly too tight at the hips, a white polyester blouse, and her scuffed boots. She had tried to polish them with an old rag, but the leather was too far gone. Precisely at 8, a black Lincoln Navigator idled up to the curb. It made no sound. It simply appeared, a massive, gleaming beast reflecting the overcast sky. The rear door clicked open. Clara swallowed the bile rising in her throat. She stepped inside. The interior smelled of rich, conditioned leather and faint peppermint. The heat was turned up, instantly melting the chill from her bones. A glass partition separated her from the driver. She was entirely alone in the back. The heavy door pulled shut with a soft, vacuum-sealed thud, cutting off the street noise completely. It felt like stepping into a sensory deprivation tank. The car glided through the streets for 40 minutes, leaving the rotting brick of the industrial district behind. They pulled into the underground parking garage of a sleek, glass-fronted high-rise in the financial district. Two men in dark suits were waiting at the elevator bay. They didn't speak to her. They just nodded, scanned a keycard, and escorted her into a private car that shot upwards so fast her ears popped. The doors slid open on the 42nd floor. There were no gilded statues or velvet curtains. Gabriel Rossi's world was shockingly clinical. Slate-grey walls, frosted glass partitions, and a heavy, unbroken silence. A lone receptionist, a woman with sharp cheekbones and cold eyes, pointed toward a set of solid oak double doors at the end of the hall. Clara walked toward them, her boots loud against the polished concrete floor. She knocked once. "Come in." Gabriel was standing by a floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the sprawling, smog-choked city. He wore a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, exposing a landscape of faded, jagged ink. He held his silver lighter, flipping the lid open and closed. Click, snap, click, snap. He turned. His eyes swept over her. They didn't linger on her body. They analyzed her posture, her white-knuckled grip on her cheap purse, the defiant tilt of her chin hiding absolute terror. "You bought the medicine," he said. Not a question. "I did." Clara stood near the door. She refused to walk deeper into the massive office. "I bought groceries. I paid the locksmith. I have $1,420 left. I brought it with me." Gabriel walked to his desk. It was an intimidating slab of black marble, completely bare except for a high-end laptop and a stack of leather-bound ledgers. He sat down, heavily, leaning his cane against the chair. "Keep it. Consider it a signing bonus." He pushed a thick ledger toward the edge of the desk. "Sit down, Clara." She walked forward, her legs stiff. She sat in the leather chair opposite him. It was too soft. It made her feel like she was sinking. "This is the Rossi Logistics Holding Company," Gabriel began, his voice perfectly detached. "We own 17 warehouses, 4 trucking fleets, and a very lucrative waste management contract with the city. On paper, we gross $40 million a year. Off paper, we gross triple that. My current bookkeeper developed a gambling habit and tried to skim from the offshore accounts." Clara's throat felt dry. "Where is he?" Gabriel looked at her. His bruised sky eyes were entirely dead. "He retired to the bottom of the harbor." A cold spike of adrenaline punched through Clara's chest. He said it so casually, like discussing the weather. "I need these books reconciled." Gabriel continued, tapping the leather cover. "Clean money on the left, dirty money on the right. You will find the discrepancies. You will flag the shell companies that are bleeding cash. You work in the room down the hall. You don't ask questions about where the money comes from. You just make the math work." Clara looked at the ledger. It looked like a normal, boring accounting book. But touching it felt like touching a live wire. "If I do this," she whispered. "If I fix your books, when am I done?" Gabriel leaned forward, resting his elbows on the marble. The faint scent of cedar and old blood drifted across the desk. "You aren't. You belong to the payroll now." He held her gaze, a heavy, suffocating weight. "Do the math, Clara. Go home to your daughter. survive. 4 weeks vanished into a blur of spreadsheets, black coffee, and crushing paranoia. Clara's new office was a windowless room 3 doors down from Gabriel's. It contained a desk, a dual-monitor computer, a shredder, and a locked filing cabinet. She worked from 8 to 4. A car picked her up. A car dropped her off. She was paid in cash, discreetly left in an envelope on her keyboard every Friday. The money was staggering. Maya had a new winter coat. The heater in their apartment was fixed. Clara had even bought real coffee beans instead of the cheap instant powder. But every bite of food tasted slightly metallic. She knew what she was looking at on those screens. She saw the bribes to city aldermen tucked under consulting fees. She saw the massive, sudden influxes of cash routed through shell corporations in the Caymans. Blood money, extortion money, drug money. She was cleaning it. She was making the violence palatable for the IRS, and she was terrifyingly good at it. She found the leak within her first 10 days. The previous accountant hadn't just been skimming. He had been rerouting a percentage of the shipping tariffs to a rival family's holding company. When Clara brought the printed spreadsheet to Gabriel, pointing out the buried routing numbers with a trembling finger, he hadn't said a word. He just stared at the paper for a long, terrible minute. Then he nodded, took the paper, and left the office. He didn't come back for 2 days. When he did, he had fresh bruises on his knuckles and a slight limp that forced him to lean heavily on his cane. Clara didn't ask. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the sterile illusion of her job violently shattered. Clara's printer had jammed. The master copy of the quarterly tax projections was stuck. She needed Gabriel's signature before she could encrypt the file. She grabbed the crumpled sheet, walked down the hall, and knocked on his heavy oak door. No answer. She knocked again. Nothing. Assuming he had stepped out, and knowing the courier was arriving in 10 minutes, she turned the brass handle and pushed the door open. "Mr. Rossi, I need—" The words died in her throat. The room smelled of copper, hot, sharp, and sickeningly sweet. Gabriel was not alone. 2 massive men in tactical gear were holding a third man on his knees in the center of the plush, expensive rug. The kneeling man was unrecognizable. His face was a swollen mass of purple and red, blood dripping from his chin in a steady, rhythmic splatter onto the wool fibers. Gabriel stood in front of him. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket. His white shirt was stark against the brutal scene. He held a pair of heavy iron pliers in his right hand. Clara froze. Her brain completely misfired. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. Gabriel slowly turned his head. His chest was heaving slightly. The cold, dead emptiness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a feral, terrifying violence. He looked at Clara. For a split second, the monster recognized the mother. Gabriel dropped the pliers. They hit the floor with a dull, heavy thud. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and slowly wiped his hands, never breaking eye contact with her. "Take him to the warehouse," Gabriel said to the guards, his voice perfectly even, completely devoid of the rage that radiated from his pores. "We're done here." The guards hauled the weeping, bleeding man to his feet and dragged him toward the private service elevator in the back of the office. Clara stood in the doorway, the crumpled tax form shaking violently in her hand. Her stomach rolled. The metallic smell was overwhelming. She took a step back, her heel catching on the carpet. Gabriel walked toward her. He stopped 5 feet away, giving her space. He tossed the bloody handkerchief onto his desk. "You didn't wait for permission to enter," he said quietly. The printer." Clara stammered, stepping back again. Her back hit the door frame. She wanted to run, but her legs felt like water. "I didn't know." Gabriel looked at her pale face. He looked at her trembling hands. A muscle ticked in his jaw. He stepped forward, closing the distance. He reached out. Clara flinched, violently squeezing her eyes shut, turning her face away. She expected a strike. She expected him to grab her throat. Instead, a warm, rough hand gently took the crumpled paper from her fingers. She opened her eyes. Gabriel was looking down at the tax form. He reached into his pocket with his clean hand, pulled out a pen, and signed the bottom line. He handed it back to her. "Never walk into a room blindly, Clara," he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "You don't want to see the things I do to keep the money clean." He turned his back on her, walking toward the window, leaning heavily on his cane. Clara fled. She ran to the women's restroom, locked herself in a stall, and dry heaved until her ribs ached. She washed her face with freezing water, staring at her reflection in the mirror. Her eyes looked older, darker. She was feeding her daughter with a monster's money, and the most terrifying part was, she knew she would go back to her desk and keep doing it. Winter hit the city with the brutality of a swung crowbar. The temperature plummeted into the single digits, freezing the slush on the sidewalks into jagged blades of black ice. It happened on a Sunday. Clara woke to a sound that made her blood run cold. It wasn't the rattling wheeze of Maya's usual asthma. It was a high, thin, whistling gasp, the sound of a child trying to pull air through a straw. Clara vaulted out of bed, sprinting across the small apartment. Maya was sitting up, her small hands clutching the collar of her pajamas, her lips carrying a terrifying bluish tint. Her chest heaved violently, pulling inward at the ribs with every failed breath. "Maya! Baby, look at Mummy!" Clara's voice cracked. She grabbed the new red inhaler, shaking it frantically, pressing it to Maya's mouth. "Breathe in. Come on, big breath." Maya tried. She pressed the trigger. Nothing happened. The inflammation was too severe. The medicine couldn't get past the swollen airways. Maya's eyes, wide and panicked, locked onto Clara's. Total blinding terror. Clara didn't bother changing out of her sweatpants. She grabbed a heavy blanket, wrapped it around the struggling child, scooped her up, and ran. The emergency room at St. Jude's was a chaotic, fluorescent nightmare of coughing patients and overworked nurses. Clara screamed for help the second she burst through the sliding doors. The triage nurse took one look at Maya's blue lips and hit a button on the wall. They took her. A swarm of blue scrubs swallowed her daughter, rushing her behind double doors where Clara wasn't allowed to follow. Hours dissolved. Clara sat on a hard plastic chair in the waiting room. She stared at a stain on the linoleum until her vision blurred. Her hands were sticky with sweat. She had forgotten her purse. She had forgotten her coat. She had left her burner phone, the one Gabriel required her to keep on her 24/7, on the kitchen counter. It was 4 p.m. on a Monday. She had missed work. She didn't care. Let him fire her. Let him kill her. If Maya died behind those double doors, Clara was already a ghost. "Mrs. Hayes." Clara snapped her head up. A doctor in green scrubs looked down at her, a clipboard pressed to his chest. His expression was grim. "Is she—" Clara couldn't finish the sentence. The words choked her. "She's stabilized," the doctor said quickly, offering a tight, reassuring nod. "We had to intubate her. Her airways were completely restricted. A severe viral pneumonia exacerbating the asthma. She's in the pediatric intensive care unit. She's asleep." Clara sagged forward, burying her face in her hands. A sob ripped out of her chest, rough and ugly. "Can I see her?" "In a moment." "But Mrs. Hayes—" The doctor hesitated. "She needs a pediatric pulmonologist. We don't have one on staff here. We need to transfer her to St. Luke's across town, but they won't accept the transfer without a massive down payment. Your insurance is—" He trailed off, looking at the clipboard. "Non-existent." "How much?" Clara asked, wiping her nose with the back of her hand, looking up at him with desperate eyes. 20,000, up front. Clara felt the floor drop out from under her. She had $1,000 hidden in a coffee can. 20,000 was a mountain. It was impossible. I can get it. Give me a day. Let me make some calls. She lied frantically. The doctor looked sympathetic but firm. I can hold her here on the ventilator for 48 hours. After that, we have to move her to a step-down unit, which isn't equipped for her severity. He walked away, leaving Clara to drown in the harsh, fluorescent light. She stood up. She had to go back to the apartment. She had to get the burner phone. She had to beg Gabriel Rossi. The heavy glass doors of the emergency room slid open. A wall of freezing air hit her, carrying the scent of expensive cedar and sharp ozone. Gabriel walked into the waiting room. He wasn't wearing a suit. He wore a heavy black wool sweater and dark jeans. His hair was messy, damp from the snow outside. He held his cane in his right hand. He stopped, scanning the crowded room, his bruised eyes locked onto Clara. He didn't look angry. He looked frantic. The impenetrable Mafia boss was gone. In his place was a man who looked like he had run 5 miles through a blizzard. He closed the distance between them in 3 long strides. He stopped right in front of her. He looked at her bare arms, goosebumps raising on her skin, and her tear-streaked, exhausted face. "You didn't answer your phone," he said. His voice was ragged. "She couldn't breathe." Clara choked out, the last thread of her composure snapping. She didn't care who he was. She didn't care about the blood on his hands. He was a solid object in a world falling apart. "She has pneumonia. They put a tube down her throat. Gabriel, they want $20,000 to move her to a specialist. I don't have it. I swear I'll work for you for the rest of my life. I'll cook the books forever. Please." Gabriel stared at her. The word pneumonia hung in the air between them, a heavy, suffocating ghost. His jaw tightened so hard Clara thought his teeth would crack. He didn't say a word. He shrugged off his heavy wool overcoat, wrapping it around Clara's freezing shoulders. The coat smelled fiercely of him, wrapping her in sudden, overwhelming warmth. He pulled a sleek black smartphone from his pocket and hit a single button. "Bring the car to the ambulance bay." Gabriel barked into the phone. "Call St. Luke's. Tell Dr. Aris to get out of bed and get to the pediatric ICU right now. Tell him the Rossi family is making a donation of $100,000 to his department, and if he isn't waiting at the doors when we arrive, I'm burning his hospital to the ground." He hung up. Clara stared at him, her mouth parted in shock. The sheer, terrifying weight of his power shifted reality in a matter of seconds. Gabriel looked down at her. His hand reached out, hesitating for a fraction of a second, before his thumb gently wiped a stray tear from her cheek. His touch was burning hot. "Nobody dies of the cold tonight, Clara," he whispered. "Show me where she is." Fluorescent lights buzzed, a low, aggressive hum that scraped against Clara's exhausted nerves. Aha! St. Luke's Pediatric Intensive Care Unit didn't smell like bleach and misery. It smelled like expensive air filtration, lavender floor wash, and quiet, terrifying competence. Maya lay in the center of a massive, state-of-the-art mechanical bed. The horrific plastic tube was gone, replaced by a clear oxygen mask that fogged slightly with every steady, rhythmic breath. The monitors hummed a gentle, consistent lullaby. Normal heart rate. Normal oxygen saturation. Clara sat in a plush armchair beside the bed. Her fingers traced the edge of Maya's thin, pale hand, careful not to disturb the IV line taped to the child's translucent skin. It was 3 a.m. on a Thursday. 3 days since the emergency room, Clara hadn't left the hospital. She had slept in brief, agonizing, 20-minute fragments, jolting awake every time a nurse walked past the door. Her neck ached. Her mouth tasted like old copper and burnt coffee. She still wore Gabriel's heavy black wool overcoat. She hadn't taken it off. It was too large, swamping her frame, but it retained a faint, stubborn trace of his scent. Cedar and cold rain. It was the only thing grounding her to reality. A shadow moved in the doorway. Clara didn't flinch. She knew the cadence of those footsteps now. Slow. Heavy. The slight, almost imperceptible drag of a cane on linoleum. Gabriel stepped into the dim room. He looked entirely out of place among the pastel walls and cartoon animal decals. He wore a charcoal suit, immaculately tailored, but his face was an ash-grey mask of pure exhaustion. The silver scar on his brow caught the dim light from the hallway. He didn't speak. He walked to the foot of the bed and looked down at the sleeping 6-year-old. His jaw ticked. "The doctors say she can go to the step-down unit tomorrow," Clara whispered. Her voice was raspy, destroyed by days of crying and disuse. "Her lungs are clearing. The antibiotics are working." Gabriel nodded once. A sharp, rigid motion. "Dr. Aris knows what he's doing. I pay him enough to ensure he never makes a mistake." Clara pulled her gaze from Maya and looked at the man standing in the shadows. $100,000. "A rounding error," Gabriel replied softly, his eyes never leaving the child. "Don't flatter yourself into thinking it bankrupts me, Clara. It buys priority. It buys oxygen. It buys us." The words slipped out before she could stop them, raw, jagged, and terrifyingly honest. Gabriel finally looked at her. His eyes, the color of a bruised winter sky, locked onto hers. The silence in the room suddenly felt dense, thick enough to choke on. He walked around the edge of the bed, stopping just inches from her chair. He leaned heavily on the silver handle of his cane. "Does it?" he asked, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a rough gravel slide in the quiet room. "Is that what you think this is? A transaction?" Clara gripped the armrests, her knuckles turned white. "What else could it be? Men like you don't save children out of the goodness of their hearts. You don't have a heart, Gabriel. I saw what you did to that man in your office. I see the ledgers. I know exactly what you are." She expected anger. She expected him to remind her of her place, to threaten her, to pull the plug on her fragile, bought security. Instead, Gabriel leaned down. He placed one large, scarred hand on the armrest of her chair, trapping her. The heat radiating off his body was immense. She could feel the subtle vibration of his breathing. "You're right," he said softly, his breath brushing against her cheek. "I am exactly what you think I am. I ruin things. I break people. I exist in the dark so people like you don't have to." He tilted his head, his gaze dropping to her trembling lips before snapping back to her eyes. "But you need to understand something, Clara. I didn't buy you. If I wanted to own you, I wouldn't have given you an office. I would have locked you in a gilded cage and thrown away the key. You're here because you chose to walk into the fire to keep your daughter warm." He straightened up, the sudden absence of his heat leaving a cold vacuum in the air. "The hospital bill is paid in full. There is a trust fund set up in Maya's name to cover her medication until she turns 18. The paperwork is completely sterile, untraceable to me or the syndicate." Gabriel reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, sleek, black phone. He set it on the bedside table. "Your old burner is compromised. Use this. When she's discharged, a car will take you to a new apartment in the Heights. Better security. Clean air." Clara stared at the phone, her chest squeezed tight. "And what do you get out of this?" Gabriel looked at her for a long, agonizing moment. The emptiness in his eyes fractured, revealing a bone-deep, terminal weariness. "A bookkeeper who knows how to keep her mouth shut," he said flatly. He turned and walked out of the room. The soft tap of his cane faded down the hallway, leaving Clara alone with the hum of the monitors and the crushing, terrifying realization that she was no longer afraid of the monster. She was afraid of how much she needed him. 2 weeks later, the air inside the Rossi Logistics holding company was suffocatingly dry. Clara sat at her desk, staring at dual monitors until the spreadsheets began to blur into a meaningless sea of green and red cells. Maya was safe. She was sitting in the living room of a sprawling, sunlit apartment on the 45th floor of a secure building, watching cartoons with a private nurse Gabriel had hired. Clara's life was completely unrecognizable. She wore tailored silk blouses and expensive heels. Her bank account held more money than she had seen in her entire life. Yet a cold dread sat permanently at the base of her spine. She clicked through a maze of offshore routing numbers, tracing a discrepancy she had noticed 3 days ago. $7 million was missing from the shipping tariffs account. It hadn't been skimmed. It had been systematically rerouted. Her finger traced the screen. Shell company to shell company. A phantom logistics firm operating out of a rusted warehouse by the docks. She cross-referenced the property deed. The name listed on the LLC was Dominic Vane. Clara's blood ran cold. Vane, the rival family, the ones Gabriel had beaten the embezzling accountant over. Vane wasn't just stealing money. He was using Rossi infrastructure to smuggle something heavy. The weight discrepancies on the shipping manifests were massive. Arms. It had to be arms. And a shipment was arriving tonight. At Pier 44. Clara grabbed the printed manifest, her hands shaking violently. She shoved her chair back, ignoring the sharp scrape of the wheels against the floor, and bolted out of her office. She ran down the hall to Gabriel's heavy oak doors. She didn't knock. She pushed them open. "Gabriel, you need to—" The office was empty. His desk was cleared. The laptop was gone. The heavy crystal ashtray was spotless. Panic spiked, sharp and hot, in Clara's throat. She pulled the black phone from her pocket and hit the single-programmed speed dial. It rang 3 times. "Speak." The voice wasn't Gabriel's. It was harsh, breathless, and punctuated by the sharp, terrifying crack of gunfire in the background. It was Luca, Gabriel's head of security. "Where is he?" Clara demanded, her voice cracking. "Pier 44. He walked into a trap, Luca. Vane used our own shipping manifests to overload the docks. The containers aren't empty. They're heavy. It's an ambush." Static crackled over the line. A heavy concussive boom rattled the speaker, making Clara flinch violently. "He knows," Luca grunted, the sound of tearing metal echoing behind him. "We're pinned behind the loading cranes. Vane brought half his muscle. They had heavy artillery waiting." "Pull him out!" Clara screamed, her professionalism completely shattering. "He won't leave the shipment. If Vane takes the pier, the Rossi family loses the eastern seaboard. Stay in the office, Clara. Lock the door." The line went dead. Clara stared at the phone. Her breathing grew shallow, rapid. The instinct to survive screamed at her to do exactly what Luca said. To lock the door. To hide under the marble desk. To go home to her daughter and pretend the blood didn't exist. She looked at the printed manifest in her hand. $7 million. Gabriel had spent hundreds of thousands keeping her daughter breathing, and he was currently bleeding out on a freezing dock for the sake of shipping crates. She ran to Gabriel's desk. She yanked open the heavy bottom drawer. She knew what was inside. She had seen him put it there. Her hand wrapped around the cold, heavy steel of a 9mm Glock. She didn't know how to shoot. She barely knew how to hold it. It felt like holding a live grenade. But she shoved it into the waistband of her skirt, pulled her coat tight, and ran for the private elevator. The drive to the docks was a blur of neon lights and frantic swerving. She took Gabriel's spare Audi, pushing the machine to its absolute limit, her hands slick with sweat against the leather steering wheel. The air at Pier 44 tasted like salt, rust, and exploded concrete. Clara slammed the car into park, behind a stack of rusted shipping containers. The sound was deafening. Automatic gunfire tore through the freezing night air, punctuated by men shouting in the dark. The floodlights over the pier were blown out, plunging the concrete expanse into a chaotic, strobe-lit nightmare of muzzle flashes. She crept along the wet metal of the containers, her heart hammering so hard it bruised her ribs. "Gabriel!" she screamed, her voice completely swallowed by the roar of a shotgun blast. She rounded the corner of a red Maersk container. A body lay on the ground. One of Vane's men, his chest ripped open, eyes staring blankly at the cloudy sky. Clara choked on a sob, pressing her hand over her mouth. The metallic smell of fresh blood was overwhelming. It coated the back of her throat. She forced herself to step over him. 50 yards away, pinned behind the heavy steel legs of a loading crane, was a pocket of resistance. 3 men. One of them was wearing a charcoal suit, his white shirt stained a horrific, spreading crimson at the shoulder. Gabriel. He was leaning heavily against the steel, firing a sleek black rifle with his good arm. Luca was beside him, barking orders into a radio. They were surrounded. Vane's men were advancing, using the rows of containers for cover. Clara pulled the Glock from her waistband. Her hands shook so violently the metal rattled against her wedding ring. A shadow moved to her left. One of Vane's men was flanking the crane. He was stepping out from behind a blue container, raising an assault rifle, aiming directly at Gabriel's exposed flank. Gabriel didn't see him. The noise was too loud. The angle was blind. Clara didn't think. There was no moral debate. There was no hesitation. The primal, terrifying instinct to protect the thing that protected her took absolute control. She raised the heavy pistol with both hands. She squeezed her eyes shut. She pulled the trigger. The kickback was violent. It threw her backward, slamming her shoulder into the corrugated metal of the container behind her. A sharp, burning pain shot up her arm. The crack of the gunshot rang in her ears, a high-pitched, ringing whine. She opened her eyes, gasping for air. The man with the assault rifle was on the ground. He wasn't moving. A dark pool was rapidly spreading under his head, staining the wet concrete black. Silence suddenly crashed over the pier. The distant wail of police sirens began to rise in the cold air. Vane's remaining men broke, scattering like roaches into the darkness, abandoning the shipment. Clara stood frozen. The gun hung limply from her hand. The smoke stung her eyes. She couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, heavy, impossible to pull into her lungs. Footsteps, heavy and uneven. Gabriel walked toward her. He was holding his right shoulder, blood seeping through his fingers, staining his crisp white shirt. He dropped his rifle. He stopped 3 feet away from her. He looked at the dead man on the ground. He looked at the smoking gun in Clara's trembling hand. His eyes, usually dead and cold, burned with a furious, terrifying heat. "What did you do?" he breathed, his voice a ragged scrape against the silence. Clara dropped the gun. It clattered against the concrete. Her knees buckled. Gabriel caught her. His uninjured arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. He smelled of sweat, cordite, and copper. He was warm. He was solid. He was entirely lethal. "You're bleeding!" Clara choked out, her hands gripping the lapels of his ruined jacket. She was shaking violently, unable to stop the tremors racking her body. "It's a graze." Gabriel grunted, his jaw tight. He buried his face in her hair. His breathing was heavy, ragged. "You shouldn't have come here, Clara. You shouldn't have seen this. You crossed the line." "They were going to kill you," she sobbed, burying her face against his intact shoulder. The reality of what she had done crashed over her. She had taken a life. She had murdered a man. "Who takes care of Maya if you die? Who takes care of me?" Gabriel stiffened. The sheer, naked vulnerability in her words hit him harder than the bullet had. He tightened his grip on her, lifting her slightly off the ground. "Luca!" Gabriel barked over his shoulder. "Wipe the gun. Call the cleaners. We have exactly 3 minutes before the sirens get here. He didn't let go of Clara. He half-carried, half-dragged her toward the idling Audi hidden in the shadows. He shoved her into the passenger seat, his blood smearing against the pristine leather. As he slammed the door shut, trapping them in the suffocating silence of the cabin, Clara realized the horrifying truth. The cage wasn't locked from the outside. She had just locked herself in. The penthouse apartment was entirely silent. The private nurse had taken Maya to the park hours ago, leaving the massive, sunlit rooms feeling hollow. Clara stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the sprawling city. The sky was a bruised purple, heavy with the threat of more snow. She held a mug of black coffee. It had gone cold 20 minutes ago. It had been 4 days since Pier 44. The news reported a gang shootout by the docks. No arrests, no suspects, just a pile of bodies and confiscated weapons. The Rossi family had consolidated their power. Gabriel had won. The heavy front door clicked open. Clara didn't turn around. She heard the soft thud of the door closing, the heavy scrape of boots on hardwood, and the rhythmic tap of the cane. Gabriel walked into the living room. His arm was in a sleek, black sling, resting against his chest. He looked paler than usual, the deep lines of exhaustion carved deeper into his face. He stopped a few feet behind her. He didn't speak. He just stood there, his presence a heavy gravitational pull in the room. Clara took a sip of the cold coffee. It tasted like ash. Maya asked where you were this morning. Clara said softly, her voice flat against the glass pane. She wanted to show you her new coloring book. Gabriel shifted his weight. Tell her I had business to attend to. I don't lie to my daughter. Clara finally turned to face him. He looked at her. Her eyes were hollow, ringed with dark circles. The tailored silk blouse was gone, replaced by a faded grey sweater. She looked exactly like the woman standing in the bakery 2 months ago. Desperate. Broken. Gabriel reached into his coat pocket with his good hand. He pulled out a thick, white envelope and tossed it onto the glass coffee table. It landed with the same heavy, substantial thud as the first envelope he had given her in her rundown apartment. Passports, Gabriel said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. For you and the kid, under the names Sarah and Emily Miller. There's a bank account routed through a clean trust in Switzerland. $5 million. The flight to Zurich leaves in 3 hours. A car is waiting downstairs. Clara stared at the envelope. Her heart gave a single, painful thump against her ribs. You're firing me, she whispered. I'm letting you go. Gabriel took a step forward, his jaw tight. You shot a man for me, Clara. You crossed a line that you can never uncross. The longer you stay in this city, the deeper the rot sets in. Eventually you wake up and you don't recognize the monster in the mirror. He gestured toward his own face, his bruised eyes filled with a stark, terrifying self-loathing. I won't let that happen to you. I won't let you become me. Clara walked toward the table. She looked down at the envelope. Salvation. A clean break. A life where she didn't have to check the shadows, where her daughter wouldn't grow up surrounded by men with guns and blood on their knuckles. She picked up the envelope. Gabriel closed his eyes. A muscle ticked violently in his cheek. He was bracing for the door to close. He was bracing for the cold. Clara walked to the gas fireplace set into the marble wall. She flicked the switch. The blue flames roared to life, casting flickering shadows across the pristine room. Without breaking eye contact with Gabriel, she tossed the thick envelope onto the artificial logs. The paper curled instantly. The thick plastic of the fake passports bubbled and melted, filling the room with the toxic scent of burning ink and plastic. Gabriel's eyes snapped open. Complete, unadulterated shock rippled across his hard features. "What the hell are you doing?" he demanded, stepping forward, dropping his cane. Clara turned to him. The firelight danced in her dark, defiant eyes. "I don't want to be Sarah Miller," she said, her voice dropping to a fierce, ragged whisper. "And I don't want clean money. I want the money that keeps my daughter breathing. I want the man who stands in front of bullets so I don't have to." She closed the distance between them. She stopped inches away from his chest. The heat from his body was a physical force, wrapping around her, pulling her in. "You think you're protecting me by sending me away?" Clara asked, reaching up, her fingers gently brushing the silver scar above his eye. He flinched, a sharp intake of breath hissing through his teeth. "You ruined me for the normal world the second you bought that cake, Gabriel. I'm not a victim anymore. I chose to pull that trigger. I chose you." Gabriel stared down at her. The rigid control he maintained over his entire empire, over his own fractured mind, finally snapped. His uninjured arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her violently against him. His mouth crashed down on hers. There was no romance in it. It was brutal, desperate, and tasting of deep, unspoken terror. It was a collision of two broken things, realizing they fit perfectly together in the dark. Clara gasped against his mouth, her hands tangling in his dark hair, pulling him closer. The kiss was messy, raw, and punishing. It tasted like cold coffee, sweat, and absolute surrender. He broke the kiss, pressing his forehead against hers. His chest heaved. His breath was ragged against her skin. "You don't know what you're doing," he grunted, his eyes squeezed shut, his grip on her bruisingly tight. "I will consume you, Clara. This world will eat you alive." Clara let her hands rest against his ruined shoulder. She felt the heavy, frantic beat of his heart through the bandage, then let it. She whispered into the quiet room, the ashes of her escape route settling into the fireplace behind them. She wasn't a saint. She was a mother who had learned to survive. And survival, she realized, as Gabriel pulled her back into the dark, crushing warmth of his chest, meant making peace with the monster who loved you. That's it for Clara and Gabriel's explosive, dark journey. If this raw, gritty Mafia romance kept you hooked until the very last drop of blood and ink, smash that like button right now. Do you think Clara made the right choice by burning her only escape, or did she just seal her own doom? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to share this video with your friends who love stories with morally grey heroes and deeply human stakes. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you never miss our next full-length audio drama. See you in the shadows.